subject I talk about is one that's very close to my heart. My first start with this idea came about through Mr. Hamilton, who some years ago, my granddaughter was a student in his class, history class, and he gave a project for anybody to interview a World War II veteran. At this time, there were a lot more veterans still around, but they said that because of the death rate going on, they wanted to get some history. So my granddaughter took it upon herself to bring a television camera and tape out to our house, and for 2 consecutive Saturdays, we sat down and talked about my experience. And that's what I pretty much will do with you. But with this tape that she made, a copy was sent to Washington, where the veterans have a collection of these veterans tapes. It's good to see you. We're just starting.
Thank you.
Okay.
Brownies down front.
That on the board is my name, Bob Hinchliff. My program, as I prepared it, is a story of World War II. World War II. In the Veterans Council or something, information that was put out in your bulletin, there was a slightly different story. But the one that I am going to present is World War II. And now World War II is an interesting period. Hey, good for you. Come on in. Tori just introduced me, so I'm Bob Hinchliff, and I'm just about to start right now. Okay, I'm going to be talking about World War II. World War II. Now that, as a term, refers to a period of time. World War II began when the Japanese bombed Pearl Harbor. World War II ended with the signing of the peace treaty in Tokyo Bay in 1945. So when we talk about World War II, we in America talk from December of 1941 to September of 1945. There's about a 4-year period, and that is called World War II. And I say it that way because sometimes people think of World War II as being strictly what took place, the actions, the such and such and such. But there are many things that happened during that 4-year period, and so to separate the actual battles from the peripheral going-ons, I have chosen to call World War II, the expression, just a period of time. Now it happens that I graduated from high school in 1940. 1940, which was just before Pearl Harbor. So I wasn't too much older than you or your older brothers or sisters, and this is when one Sunday morning, walking home from the church service, we heard that the Japanese had bombed Pearl Harbor. We had no idea. Pearl Harbor. So where is Pearl Harbor? Well, anyway, we found out quickly enough, and we were thrown right into what I called the World War II that day. And the advice that came down was, continue to do what you're doing now, don't get all excited. But what I did was I enlisted in the Army shortly after that, and I stayed in the Army for 4.5 years. When I went into the Army, I sort of cut off my civilian activity and became first just a soldier, then I was commissioned, and then I was assigned to the 78th Infantry Division, where I trained my men, and we shipped out. Go right in.
You're really popular.
Yeah, it is. It's wonderful.
Brownies down front.
There's more seats over here if you like them, or down in front.
Oh, don't they?
Good. Nice to see everybody. So I was just introducing myself after Tori had given the fact that I live in Wellesley here. But I'm talking about World War II. And World War II, I just said, began with Pearl Harbor. in December of 1941, the Japanese bombed Pearl Harbor, and at the time of happening, we had no idea where Pearl Harbor was. But we certainly learned about it, and we suddenly became World War II people. And when I speak of World War II, that's what I'm talking about. That period of time that elapsed between Pearl Harbor and the signing of the peace treaty in Tokyo Bay in 1945. Okay, well, I was a civilian. As I say, I graduated from high school in 1940, just before Pearl Harbor. And I went into the Army as a volunteer. I wanted to do like all of the other young men of my time. They wanted to get into the war with us. So we signed up, but because there was such an onrush of people, some of us who were in college were told, you just take it easy, we'll have time for you. So eventually I was called up. I signed up. I was called to active duty. I went to OCS and became an officer. And starting in 1942, I've had my own company with the 78th Infantry Division. We went to Europe. But there were two wars going on, as you know, during the period, the Pacific and the Europe. Well, I was strictly in the Europe area, so that I was assigned to the 78th Division. No, I'm not sure. I think I should probably start some of this. My daughter put together a, what's this from?
PowerPoint.
Well, a PowerPoint. So I'm not familiar. I know which button to push to go forward and such. So if it goes right, this is what will happen. So first of all, my name is Bob Hinchcliffe. I live here in Wellesley. I was born in 1922, so I had my 90th birthday last Halloween. I can't take any credit for it. The doctors and the other people who kept me going, but I am now over 90 years old, if you believe it. And I wouldn't be able to vote if I were in Rome today, because you have to be below 80 to do that. But anyway, this is, first of all, here. Now this is me. This is in the, this is when I first was commissioned. So this has been about 1943. I have no ribbons, as you see. I do have the lieutenant bars. The cross rifles indicate that I was infantry and the U.S., and that was my picture back in about 18 years old, 19 years old at that time. No, I went too far. There you go. These are my brothers and my sister. I have two brothers. One, well, there's two middle ones. Let's start with at the extreme end is my sister, who signed up with the Navy, was stationed in Washington, D.C. Next to Rita Mae was my brother Tommy, my older brother. He was in the anti-aircraft. He was in the South Pacific. Next to that is my younger brother Joe, who was a pilot flying out of India across the hump to China. And this is me at this end here. And now I have my rifleman badge, which combat infantry badge, which meant that I was actually in combat. Now, that's an interesting feature because people in World War II, we had 16 million Americans in uniform. 16 million. The country was about 200 million population. We had 16 million people in uniform. But of those 16 million, there was about 500,000 that actually were combat. You know, you need a lot of support all the way through, and that was the fringe. But for us, who actually fought in the foxholes, in the woods, in the islands of the Pacific, that was the combat. So I'm at this end, and that badge, this upper one here, is combat infantry. If you ever see anybody with that, it means that they were actually being fired on by the Japanese or by the Germans, and that's one that I'm quite proud of. I do have now the Bronze Star, which was a result of some action on my part during the Battle of the Bulge, but at this point, I didn't leave that. we were in London, and then we came across, and I landed on the beaches up here near to the Havre, and that's when we started our battle for Germany. Well, what you had to do is to push all the Germans back here, and the war would end when we occupied all of Germany. Now, the Russians came from this way, and we were coming this way, and so this just shows where in 1944, this is what the country was like. Now, the thing I wanted to point out is this is Switzerland. We had our battle line came from the English Channel all the way down to the border of Switzerland. This is where we were at the time of the Battle of Bulge. Now, the distance here looks like that, but in America, that would be the relative distance between Boston and Washington, D.C. If you can imagine, we had troops for every mile between Boston and Washington, D.C., which was the distance between the English Channel, the North Sea here, and Switzerland. So we were occupying this entire area here, moving in this direction toward Germany. And that is about where we started our action. So we were sent to England, and from England after time, we crossed the Channel and landed on the beaches of Normandy. Now, during the war, we were not allowed to have a camera. See, we were within 200 yards or 1,000 yards at the most from the enemy ahead of us. The difference between the two front lines was range, well, during the Battle of the Bulge, it was measured in feet. As a matter of fact, we were 18 miles deep behind the German lines because of the way the battle was going then. But typically, during most of the war, we were within 200 yards, 1,000 yards of the German troops. So during that entire period, we were not allowed to have any cameras. So unfortunately, I don't have any pictures of the trenches, the enemy tanks that we hit, or that. So we had to go on that thing. So here is myself with just after, but we had just captured a little city called Roseburg, Germany. And in order to get to it, we had to walk across a little stream. And when I had reconnoitered it beforehand, there was an ice covering, so no problem, we could walk across it. Well, unfortunately, by the time we got to it the next morning, the ice had broken, and so all of my men, as they went through the water, got their feet wet. Well, there's nothing worse than having wet feet in snow. This was cold. And so they stayed with their wet feet, and overnight, the feet just swelled, and it was called trench foot. And it turned out that these men, and there were about 24 of my men, who couldn't get out of their foxholes to get back to the aid station. So I got together a group of about 12 of my other men, volunteered to go forward and carry them individually from their foxholes back to the aid station. We had just about completed. We did this at 2 o'clock in the morning, 3 o'clock in the morning, something like that. We had just finished that, and we're coming back for more when the German artillery came in on us. And 3 of my men that I had trained all the way from the States were killed. So in writing a letter back to their parents, I wanted to make it a more glamorous affair, so I wrote in asking the colonel to have the Bronze Star awarded to all those 12 men. And when I got back there, the colonel called, he said, "Bob, you were also with it. I'm putting your name on the list also." So this battle was in December of 1944. We got the Bronze Star for having helped carry these men from the foxholes back, and we lost them. We had casualties all the time, because when you're in the infantry, and again I say we're right there in the front of it, anyway, I got the Bronze Star, and so that's the medal unit there is the combat infantryman badge. The red with the blue stripe is the Bronze Star, and the others are indications of the number of battles in the process of being in Germany. Now, we jump ahead here, because I haven't pictures of the war, but when the war ended, and in Japan, the war was still going on, but if you remember, we were scheduled to ship out from Marseille, France, on August 28th, to get over to the Pacific for a November invasion of Japan. Well, on the first week of August, you might remember, the Americans dropped the bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Well, that happened the first week of August. The middle of August, the Japanese surrendered, and so our scheduled shipment out of Marseille on the 28th was changed. Instead of going to Japan, they took our division and put us into the Army of Occupation, and my particular regiment was assigned to the city of Berlin. So I went into Berlin to occupy that, and I became the aide to the commanding general of troops in Europe. So I spent the last year after the war in Berlin and Europe, seeing everything. Well, this is a picture of, I'm on this end, this is at the Officers Club in Berlin. The Colonel Caldwell is the far end, no, Colonel Hensley is the far end, Colonel Caldwell is the bald-headed man, the General Dalby is the one next to it. This other lieutenant, I don't remember who he was, and here I was at this end. So this is in Berlin at the Officers Club at the end of the war. The war was over at this time. Now this is something, when we were in Berlin, Berlin was divided into 4 sections. The same as you know, Europe was divided between the Russians, the French, the English, and the Americans. Well, Berlin was the same way. And see, East Berlin was the Russian, Northwest Berlin was the English, Southwest Berlin was the American, and a little sliver between the north and south there was where the French were. Now, every month, the commanding generals of each of those 4 sectors got together for what I call, a social get-together. And this is a picture at the Berlin Stadium where the Russian generals, French, German, and American were here. I think this was for a special event where the British were marching the troops in the Olympic Stadium of '39. That was a picture of the Russian generals and such. And this is General Dalby. He was my general. He was a parachute general. He had jumped at the time of the crossing of the Rhine River. And he was 45 years old, and I couldn't imagine an old man of 45 jumping out of an airplane. But he did. He jumped when they crossed the Rhine. Now, this is our home in Berlin. This is fascinating now. Berlin has a big lake in the southwest called the Wannsee. Big lake, like Lake Champlain up here. Big lake, big lake. And they had an island going out into the lake that the Nazi party, when they came in, they took over all those beautiful homes, and the people moved into it. Well, this is Joseph Goebbels' house. He, his wife, and children lived in this one. This is obviously after the war, after the house was pretty well destroyed with bombs and the Russians coming in. But this is Joseph Goebbels' house. Over here is Adolf Hitler's house. And between the two of them, Hitler's private doctor, Dr. Mandel, this was his house. And that's what became our house when we lived in Berlin for that year. We don't know why, but there were about 10 houses on this island, all occupied by the top people of the Nazi party. And all of them were destroyed, except this one. And the only reason we could imagine is that all the other houses had the Nazi symbol or something on it. So when the Russian troops came in, they destroyed anything that had any resemblance to Nazi. So they destroyed it, and this they left untouched. So for my general, they had it set up, and these windows up here are my room. From there, the most beautiful, this window in here was a window as big as, and it was almost like an elevator, that the whole thing would disappear into the ground whenever there was an air raid. In middle winter, because they had no way of replacing it. So the instruction for the people who were living in the house was, as soon as the air raid fired, you push the button, and down into the ground, disappeared the window. So it was still there. We got there, the most beautiful home that existed in Berlin, and I spent a year there. So this is the home, that's where Joseph Goebbels lived, and out here in front is all of the lake, the Wannsee. This is the same sort of picture of the house in my room there with the shade. I was flying in a little Piper Cub this time. In Berlin, the paratroopers and all the American paratroopers had come in, and one of my friends, matter of fact, friend of the general too, was a pilot for a little Piper Cub. Well, he offered to take me on a tour of Berlin in the air. With my camera, I could take pictures. So this picture was taken by me as we were flying over the Wannsee, the lake, of our house, and this was Hitler's, sort of his branch house. That was just the garage was there. And this is the view from my room out to the lake. And you can picture out of my window there. Now, being one of the privileges of the general, we had our own sailboat on Lake Wannsee, and we were getting all of these visitors from every politician in Washington wanted to come to Berlin because this meant that the war was over. They had succeeded, we captured, so my biggest job as an aide to the general was entertaining his guests as they came to Berlin. And one of the ways where did that come from? Berlin was so far on the flight plane, the flight distance for the bombers, that they carried more of the incendiaries to burn, which left the wall standing. And that's why you see so many walls standing, but the structures burned, because in the early days of bombing Berlin, they used more firebombs than they did high explosive. And this is right downtown Berlin. I'm impressed with this picture. This was the Tiergarten. The Tiergarten, which was what it is, trees grown, but the Germans needed heat in the winter, so they were given permission to cut down the trees. So this little area here with a boy standing looking on, is more or less of a, what would you call it, a deserted area, an area that was just bombed out. And today, of course, Berlin is the most modern capital city you can imagine. If you go back, I have never been back. I lost so many men in combat that I have no desire to get back any place into Germany, so I've never been back. But other people who have been there have told me that it's a beautiful city. This is another view of the Tiergarten with a Russian statue put in here. But you can see these were all trees that had been here, cut down by the Germans for heat. This picture, in the days after the war, I was able to go travel with the general through the area. This, I went down to Rome. And at the time we were in Rome, I guess the Americans used to say, were such a force that there was no place you couldn't go. So I was able to go up to the very top. And now, the very top of St. Peter's Cathedral is what this is. In other words, you can go up to a level today, at this level here, where probably you can get 30 or 40 people, and then you can go up above it, where they only allow 6 people at a time, and that's right up at the crown. And that's where this is here. I was at the area where there were only about 6 who could get up there at the time. So that's another remembrance of. This is on the ship coming home after the end of the war. And recently, I had the chance to have an article put in the Wellesley Weston magazine. And they took pictures of us and our doing where we were. And this is one of their pictures that, on my lap, is a picture of me before I went into combat. And sitting in the chair is me about 4 weeks ago. So it has a change. Now, we do run a parade in Wellesley every May, and one year, a few years ago, I was the honored person with it. So these pictures were in Wellesley recently. And this shows, of course, the Germany that we had.
That's
I
the,
think all
that's
it
the end,
says,
yeah.
yes. So that's the story somewhat of my doing. But I did want to mention to you that as a person not too much older than you folks are right now, I was brought into the period called World War II. Everything changed from a civilian day like we're having today, as though you went home today and suddenly something had transpired and you were on rations. No gasoline, food limited, your own doings, and the men all being sent off to the war. So as quick as that, changing from a status much the same as you are, we suddenly became soldiers of World War II. I received my commission. I was assigned to the 78th Infantry Division. We were shipped out to England to join the invasion of Normandy. We did fight, and from the time I went ashore at the beaches of Normandy, we fought across northern France, into Belgium, through Belgium, into Germany. And the Germans at that point had what they called the West Wall. We called it the Siegfried Line. The Siegfried Line was built by the Germans during the 30s, which had all of these cement forts, if you will, little forts where they could put their guns, so that as we were attacking, the Germans were inside these forts shooting at us. We were in the outside, and we had to work our way up to get the Germans out of those forts so we could go through. When we did that, we succeeded. One of our major battles was the Hurtgen Forest. And this is after having Patton and the others going across France with almost open countryside. We suddenly got into a heavy forest where we couldn't use tanks, we couldn't use aircraft. It was strictly men with rifles. And this is where we had horrendous casualties, and it was in the Hurtgen Forest. At that time, we were just finishing the Hurtgen Forest when the Battle of the Bulge began. The German, a week before Christmas of 1944, the Germans brought up equipment that we didn't know they existed. They brought it up and they attacked us. And because the divisions to the right of us gave way, the Germans came right through and were 18 miles behind us, who had held our position on the line. And so we had to sit here for about 6 weeks. Not had to sit here, but we did sit here for 6 weeks until Patton could come up from the south. The British could come down from the north, and they drove the Germans back out of the Bulge, back to the straight line, which is pretty much the Rohr River. And at that point, we were able to get on. We started moving forward. We went across the Rhineland. We came to the Rhine River. Now, there was only one bridge in the whole Rhine River that the Germans didn't destroy beforehand. And that was the bridge right in front of us. It was a railroad bridge at Remagen. And so we were the ones coming up to it. As soon as it was seen, we decided we had to get across. So I was in the first unit, not the first man, but the first unit, to get across the bridge onto the east side of the Rhine River. And once we were across there, and the others could come over behind us, there really was nothing the Germans had to defend their way. The Russians were coming in from the east. They had already captured Berlin, and so they were coming. We got to the, what was the name of the, I forget the name of the river right now, but it was the dividing line between the Russians coming this way and us going this way. I'll think of the name as soon as I leave the meeting.
Moselle?
But,
Moselle?
no.
The L?
Moselle.
Was it the L?
The Elbe, right.
Oh.
There's it.
Ding, 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 you win.
The Elbe River, exactly. The Elbe River, which ran sort of parallel to the Rhine River, but halfway to Berlin. And that was where the Russians came this way, we came this way, and that's where we stopped, and that's where the war ended as far as we were concerned. And as I said, there was still a war going on in the Pacific, so we were assigned to ship out of Marseille the end of August to go to the Philippines and then to Japan. But obviously when the atomic bombs were dropped, Japan surrendered, and so in September of 1945, the war came to an end. And that really brought to an end this period of time that I refer to as World War II. The recruit stations were long lines. Everybody wanted to get aboard. They didn't want to miss out on this. And so following the precedent, there were actually 29 of us who were close friends at the school, all enlisted. We were all inducted, as it turned out, the same day. We were all commissioned the same day. We fought the war. 2 of our members were killed during the war, and we've had reunions ever since the war for, well, I guess about 3 years ago. We stopped 3 years ago because there were only 2 of us left. So it was one of those stories. But everybody wanted to participate in the war, and none of us knew what we were getting into, but I signed up intentionally for the infantry. Many of the others went for the Air Corps or the Navy. It was a popular unit to sign up with. So that's what happened. I signed up for that. When they had room enough to bring us in, because so many people had signed up, when they had room enough for us to be brought in, we brought in, and from that time I fought the war until it was over. Okay. Yes, ma'am.
When you came home from the war, what kind of differences were there, like living at home, and just how was that like?
I'm going to sit down for just a minute, but this is a good question. So by the time I came home, which was the summer of '46, I came back to go back to college because I had not done my senior year. So I came back in September of '46 to get my senior degree. And at that time, I had already spent more than a year in what would be a civilian type of atmosphere. So I didn't have any of the ill effects of leaving a bombing area to come into a civilian home and going back to the bombing area. This is what the thing is. So, and everything I talk about, incidentally, was as far as the 1940 World War II Army. There'll never be another war like this, because we had, men galore, and today they don't fight for land, which is what we fought. As long as we could fight to take German land back to us, the war was on. Once we captured Berlin and all that, the war was over. So this was a case of measuring success in terms of land occupied. Today, and Korea was pretty much that same way, but Vietnam was pretty much just of a fighting area. You went in, you soldiers went in to kill as many of the enemy as you could, and then it pulled it right back, so we didn't hold on to property. Whereas in World War II, when we captured a city, we held on to that city, and it was frightening because you always knew you were going to have a counterattack the next day, but after you had that counterattack, you were pretty well set up, and so we would hold that position, and except for such a thing as the Battle of the Bulge, when we did lose a lot of the land back to Germans, and then had to go back in and capture it again. Except for that, we pretty much, as we moved forward, always held on to what we already had beforehand. So I never ran into any of the problems that I read about today, where the poor people are, right there in the middle of the war, they get on an airplane, come back to Boston, you know, you're like, "Whoa, you know, what's going on here?" Because everybody's a civilian back here. But then they get another plane to fly back to Afghan. Oh, no. So what the trouble they're going through mentally is something that we never had to experience. And I can explain that because and none of my men that I know of had any mental problems, because likewise, when the war ended, they were assigned to occupying Germany for the better part of a year, so they went from a combat condition to a peace condition to coming home. So it made a different life entirely. Yes, ma'am.
I noticed your family portrait of all of your siblings in
Yes.
uniform is really striking. How common was it for other families that you knew in your community to have all of the children involved in the services?
That's a good question, because you might remember that there was a family by the name of Campbells. They were all in the Navy. There were 5 brothers who were in the Navy, all on one ship, the Navy Intelligence down in Washington. She never left the States. But my older brother was the first one who was drafted, then went to OCS, got his commission in the anti-aircraft, and was sent down to Guadalcanal. So he was down there. My younger brother next came along, and he wanted to be a pilot. So he went into the Air Corps, he got his pilot, and they sent him down to India, down to fly over the hump from India to China, back and forth. And then I was the other one. I was the lucky boy who got into the infantry, and I was with the infantry for the whole war until I finally was discharged in September of 1946, and I have not been involved in the Army in any way since then. Those 29 people I mentioned to you, who, when all of us went into the Army at the same time, we have had reunions every year since 1988. Was the first year that I brought everybody together. We've been meeting down at Cape Cod in May. It was good to see everybody, but now just, as far as I know, there are only 2 of us still living. One lives in Needham and goes to Florida in the winter, and I live in Wellesley. So that's how time has caught up. I think I told some of the boys earlier that I had my 90th birthday last Halloween. I was born in 1922. A long time ago, but I was almost like you folks, a student at high school in 1940 when the World War II really got underway.
Do you want to tell them a little bit about what the daily life was like when you were fighting, you know, digging foxholes and not being able to change your clothes for weeks?
Yeah, that's that part. My daughter is a great help here because she has been following my stories for the last 20 years, and she knows it as well as I do. But some of the interesting parts is, it's never discussed, but with the infantry, when you go into combat, you go in with what you have on. When I left England to come across the channel to land on the beach to come up, the clothes that I put on in England, I was still wearing in October. You know, literally the same clothes. And then when we were in the, almost to Belgium at that time, the engineers located a coal mine, in Belgium, coal mine, that had facilities for the coal miners. At the end of their day, they would come up and go into this nice warm shower, and they had taken off their street clothes. When they came to work in the morning, put on their work clothes to go down. So when they came up there, they'd take off their work clothes, get a nice shower, put on their street clothes, and go home. Well, this was an ideal setup for us, and so our engineers took it over. And what they would do was they would give a squad is 10 men. We had no reserve. You see, when we were in the line fighting, we were fighting. There's nobody back here to take our places. We fought. So from the day we went into combat until really the war ended, we were in combat. I never had a weekend pass or a trip back to Paris or such during the war. The infantry, which was in the front lines, were there, and we were there, so that we just stayed put. And that's what happened with the clothes. You didn't have a chance to change your clothes, but every 2 to 3 months, they would get a facility like a shower. We'd come back, I still think lovely of it. You go in and you strip down everything. You kept your shoes and your helmet and your guns. But you just stripped down, went in, and had about 10 or 15 minutes of that thriving water. Whoa, wonderful. And then as you came out the other side, it was like going into a supply room. You had the trousers, the shirts there. You'd pick up a whole new set of you had 2 pairs of socks. That's the only thing you had double. 2 pairs of socks. And you come out the other, put on this, and you think you're in heaven. Close thing. And you go on for, now once again, a couple of months. Because I know I was talking to a group at one point and mentioned this, and one of the fellows said, I was in Italy, and we had to go 6 months before we could change our clothes. They were having more trouble getting clothes up in Italy. So, did you hear? Now, just, I know it's tough, it's a different world entirely, but when I hear of some of these ladies who want to be in combat units, and I think, I know it's not the same combat unit today that we were, but I don't think the women could last overnight, because they were, if we fought in the woods, forest, or the foxholes, we slept in that foxhole. We came back to get our food, came back to the foxhole to eat within it. We were within a couple of 100 yards of the Germans during the entire time of combat. And so our biggest thing was just to keep ourselves unseen, because as long as we didn't show anything, the German wouldn't shoot at us. And likewise, we didn't shoot at the Germans until we were about to capture another village. That was the way we fought in Europe. The villages that France had and Germany had, because they were developed in the feudal stages when everybody wanted to live close together, and they had the pasture land for the animals and the vegetables on the outside. You'd have one village here, another village here, another. And so when we went to war that way, we would capture this village, then we'd capture that village. So those were our targets for each of our, and we could move ourselves forward. But wherever we were at that moment, the end of the day, that was our night. That's where we slept that night. That's where we would get our breakfast in the morning when it was brought up to us. But as I say, we're never going to have another war like World War II, so we don't have to worry about those things. But I thank all of you for coming, because I don't know whether it's been fascinating, but I think the mere fact that World War II is, well, 70 years ago now, so there are fewer and fewer of us who fought during the war. And there have been so many people who talk about how they participated in World War II, but really they had nothing to do with the war as such, but they happened to be in existence with other activities going on at that period of time. So it's, I like the opportunity to get to talk to you people here, and I always see smiling faces, so I know that the words I'm using are not foreign words, and they do understand what we're trying to talk about. I live in Wellesley. My daughter is here. My daughter is Beth Hinchcliffe. She writes for the Townsman on occasion, and she wrote the history of Wellesley, the 5 pounds.
Oh, yeah, see if you can remember.
5 pounds corn and 6 pounds of
5 pounds
corn.
currency, 3 pounds of corn.
Okay. So it's a book, the history of Wellesley, and she wrote it for the 100th anniversary that in 1981. So that's my daughter. I used to be known for what I did around town, but now all I'm known for is I'm Beth's father. And it's a nice attitude to have, too. But I thank all of you for coming here. I know it's something out of the ordinary. You don't have to play out. I know that one of the other teachers that's around here is going to have me come and talk to her class, because she had not thought that this is going to be the story. So. And Tori is the man who led this group.
Well, did you have any more questions that you'd like to ask Bob? Yes.
And it was unbelievable how many people who had no intention of going to college came out of the war, went back to college, and benefited. The whole country, the whole world benefited by having these college, and that was it. Second thing was homes. I used the Bill of Rights to get my mortgage for the house, because they gave us, gosh, years ago, I think it was 4% interest that we had to pay on it. And the first two homes that we had, I had a GI mortgage at that time. What else did I have? Because I did take some evening courses, which are just extraneous. I am a CPA accountant by profession. You'd never think of it in terms of being a combat infantryman, being a pencil pusher, but that was my livelihood. I spent 4 years in accounting. I was with the Bell System, the telephone company. And before your time, you probably never remember the New England Telephone Company and the NINEX and Verizon now. So, well, that was my company. I retired in 1980. This is really my first time inside the high school, but I am overly impressed with what facilities you have to, well, this thing here. I know, that's what Beth said, if you ever need help, just go to your grandchild, and they'll tell you how to do this. Well, that's what happened here. To set this thing up, one of your members of the committee here came in and set it up, so all he did is push this button to go ahead and this button to go back. And so at some point in time, it went out of my control. I didn't do anything for it, just not knowing how to do it. But I am impressed with what we have in Wellesley.
Are there any more questions? Yes.
Did you personally do anything with the Japanese internment camp?
I miss hearing them.
Did you have anything to do with the Japanese internment camps?
No, absolutely. The one interesting there is when I was at school, before being called to active duty, we had students whose parents were living in those camps in California or Nevada or something, and they were released from the camps to come to school here in Boston. But when I was in Germany, I did go to the
Nuremberg.
The Nuremberg trials. I went to the Nuremberg trials, and just outside of the city of Nuremberg was Dachau. Dachau was a concentration camp that the Germans had set up for their prisoners, and so I had the chance to get over there to see it. I'm being told that the hour...
No, I think he's pointing out where it is.
Munich.
Yeah, it's just, what's that city?
Munich right here. Munich, Dachau is...
It is, it's right...
south or north of
Yeah,
Munich.
yeah, it is, it's right down there, but I did have a chance. The prisoners were all out of the camp at that time, but everything else was as it was there, so I did have a chance to see that. But I'm sorry it took more time than, they're about 30 feet high, and they were planted at the end of World War I, when all the trees were knocked down. They planted these things, so when you got into the Hurtgen forest, you couldn't hold on to the man ahead of you because the trees were so dark. You couldn't use tanks, we couldn't use airplanes, because you did this. And so the Germans, who were there ahead of us, were set up in these ideal fire lanes. You know, around here you have these places where your power comes down and you cut open lanes so you can follow. They knew that we'd have to be going up cliffs, so they set up the guns to do that. But it was awful.
Was your unit one of the ones that, after going through the forest, got sent back to the front where the Battle of the Bulge happened for, like, rest?
Well,
It was so badly involved.
the Hurtgen Forest was about 20 miles north to south and about 10 miles east to west. A big, actually there were 4 different forests, but we Americans just referred to the whole thing as a Hurtgen Forest. At the very south end of that, you came into the Ardennes. The Ardennes. And that was the area from there down south that when the Germans broke through the Battle of the Bulge, they came through the Ardennes. So this was at the very southern end of the Hurtgen Forest. So we, not we individual, but other American divisions, pardon me, other divisions had been fighting through here and not being able to get through the Hurtgen Forest because the Germans had the wonderful defense. So they finally took us down.
Good afternoon. The following students have